and do a screen share if I can find the. Oh, how do I find the screen share? Oh, okay, some bits tied. Sorry. Okay, there we go. Do you see that?
Yeah.
Okay. That's just notes and references. If you want to start with a brief update from each of us, start with you, Kenric.
Yeah, well, I had a terrific July 4th weekend. I ran in my hometown's road race, which is always painful, but I'm glad I could still do it. And then enjoyed some time with my cousins.
Steph, do you want to say anything or any notices or briefings?
Is this a time to share things about the Banzoff index, or would that...
No,
No.
just a warm up, very
Personal.
brief, a couple of sentences. Sorry, I should explain that. Yeah.
It's everything's well here. Glad to be back into celebrated July 4th, Independence Day in the United States. So catching up on some emails today from what I missed yesterday, but everything is well.
Good to hear. Aharon, sorry.
Yeah. Well, I'm back in Tel Aviv, enjoying once again the city life for the summer. Maybe later we go back to the kibbutz. As you see, different background, different apartment, and working a lot. I also make some proposal assessment during the last days, great exercise, and also another source of income. I hope, yeah, working.
Yeah, we all have to get busy doing our proposal assessments, don't we? So, Thorsten, what have you been up to?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you. I feel I'm busy, never stop working. Didn't have the 4th of July. Wish that my days would be a bit longer, but yeah, starting to catch up with a few things. But I mean, it's now PA phase, and that's kind of keeping me busy. So, but nevertheless, I send a message back to also Kenric today. I will start catching up on things, and then we can talk about that later.
Yeah,
Yeah.
great.
And yeah, I've had a good weekend. I transcribed Charles's video on the roadmap and governance and tweeted out about that. It's very interesting, and probably going to start doing some proposal assessor, but quite positive and looking forward to starting work. So if we get on to, I've created a little item here, Kenric, for research budget in case you have anything to say about that.
Yeah, well, I can just say, and so the research budget will support myself and Thorsten in the work of editing this white paper. And then we also have a small amount reserved to provide some rewards for community members who do a more thorough review of the white paper. And actually, Thorsten and I need to probably have a separate meeting. We could talk a little bit about that today, and then maybe I'll probably set up a separate meeting to have Thorsten begin to recruit some reviewers. And once we're done with our draft this month, I'm hoping that we can engage them kind of in the August timeframe. And then September would be, finalizing the white paper.
Okay, and there's no real updates on project planning. This is the second meeting. We're just about to start. Well, the first meeting was we introduced ourselves. Kevin's done an update on who is starting to commit, so we're getting an idea of who is going to be working on the white papers and who isn't. But if we move on to the white paper section, and I'll hand it over to you, to Kenric, to facilitate this section. I've divided.
Yeah, very good. So Philip isn't with us, but after the meeting, I'll follow up with an email and try to get a written update from him.
I see that Philip just emailed us, apologizing for not participating.
Okay, very good. Okay, excellent. All right, so then we could go to Aharon, and you can discuss any progress you've made on your section, Aharon.
Well, I have added some bullets, more details about the how concerns can fit in this this framework. How we can imagine, I'm not sure we talked about it last meeting about how we can see different voting mechanism and decision-making processes as building blocks that can compile together like different components for different processes, for different needs of communities and DAOs and maybe even centralized organizations. So I sketch it in the diagram that I present last meeting. I added to the draft of the white paper, and also it is important to mention. Maybe it's important to mention how it will fit into the consensus platform process itself, as a way of creating different documents or different agreements in consent terminology that can be used for different purposes and be used by different voting mechanism and decision-making processes. So the liquid democracy system is the main component of it, but it is not the only one. Other will be direct democracy as we do it now, or more like a plutocratic coin voting. That's it. I don't know if there is anything else to add. You can see the bullets in the draft in the Google Doc. That's it for now, I think.
Okay, that's great, Aaron. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions or want to understand a little bit more about what Aaron is working on?
Consens, can you just catch me up? What consens is?
Well, it is a platform for creating agreements, a discussion, online discussion platform that its added value is that the discussion has a product. It's not just discussion for discussion, and the product is a document that can be edited by the all participant in a scalable manner. It is integrating both the discussion features like commenting and replying, and also voting, ongoing voting on different section and different section versions. So it is the ongoing process that all the time gather the level of consensus of the participant and allow them also to add more and more information and data to the process. I've been working on a demo for it. It's almost ready. Maybe next meeting I will present it. And also, Kenric, we have scheduled a meeting with our team later this week.
Yes.
Thursday. I will dedicate some of the meeting to present the consensus method, the main algorithm that stand in the heart of the consensus mechanism, the ones that determine when and how sections can be added to the draft. We will record it and I will send it to you. I don't want to take too much time of this meeting, but this is part of the process that our platform provides that can be integrated with other aspect of voting mechanism and decision making.
Okay, great. Yeah, that sounds very good.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah, and I see that the diagram's now in the white paper and you've got your bullets, so that's extremely helpful. And I would encourage others to do that as well. And then the other thing I would suggest is if you prefer to kind of work in your own document rather than in the community document for now, then at least provide a link to that with sharing to the other members of this group. And then also to clarify, sometime in August, we'll be opening the document up to the reviewers for giving them kind of reviewing capability. And then ultimately, when we're done, we'll be sharing it with the public at large. That, at least for now, that's the process I'm planning. So if if people make requests to see the document sooner, then my suggestion is that they become candidates to be reviewers. That would be their path to having an early look at this and making a contribution to it.
Are we planning to work in very academic methodology on this specific paper? It will be peer reviewed in the academic aspect?
Well, what I see is that's a great question, and I see it as a process. So under this Fund 8 round, my goal is to write a very high quality white paper. And I'm kind of envisioning it now where Steve, Thorsten, and I are called editors of this white paper, but not, and then we're only authors of the section unless we're specifically collaborating with the lead author on that section and adding writing input to it. I think we will definitely be following academic practices of, reporting facts, having clear, thorough citation of prior work, and doing peer review within our between ourselves, and then also with the reviewers. Now, at the end of this, what I would say is that at the end of this process, we can decide how far along we are towards something that could be submitted to a good journal. I'm not setting that as a goal that we will have completed. And we did not, for Fund 9, both Steve and I were pretty busy, so there isn't a specific follow-on proposal, but I could see doing that in Fund 10. And then as long as we have the foundations for it, I'd be comfortable proposing a peer-reviewed journal article as a goal to refine this, get it more polished, and to choose a journal to work with on the peer reviews. That's a great question. Thanks, Henry.
Yeah, thanks.
So it's a process, is my point. And I've been telling, because I've had requests now. I do publish and I enjoy publishing. I've had requests to help teams do that. And what I say to them is you should think of it as a 3-year process. It takes a year to create original data and do original experiments. It takes another year to write that up into a really high quality paper. And then it takes a 3rd year to get it reviewed. Now, of course, if you have a pipeline and you have a particularly creative idea out of that pipeline, that can all be done faster. But I think where we're starting fresh as a new team, that would be my expectation, that it could be as long as a 3-year process.
I mean, I would just add to that, Fund 8 was very busy. I would be certainly interested in Fund 10 in participating in something like that. Again, community collaboration on an academic paper, but eventually progressing to some sort of journal submission, I think that would be great for the community. And there's also things coming along like the Edinburgh Decentralization Index and things like that we could feed into. So,
yeah. And the more original results that you can kind of start to document in this white paper, the further along we'll be. So the first goal, in a sense, is to get some original results.
What do you mean by original results?
Well, what I mean, so and this gets maybe clarifying it too. What I've emphasized as our goal for this project is to define the measurements that are really crucial for the community to be aware of and to start building the tools to both to monitor the process of decentralized decision-making and to monitor the outcomes of that. How good are the decisions and do they produce a strong ecosystem? Those are things we really should be focused on. And so like, I think as you've reviewed in your own work, you're doing that, Aaron, by documenting the processes that go into producing high quality documents, right, as a community. And then if we want to segue here, we could begin talking Steph's work on actually developing the tools to measure the bands-off power index. So maybe that's a good segue, Steph, and you can describe any progress you have on that.
Yeah. So it sounds like an original result here would be if we could calculate the bands-off power index for the Catalyst community. And that's a big goal, I think, because defining the processes of how Catalyst works into what is like a formula for calculating the power index is, I think, has subjectivity built into it, or not subjectivity, but how do we define the rules and parameters of what constitutes a voter and getting that data and then running it through the formula. I do have, so Kenric and I met with somebody that defined that formula within my organization, within Wolfram Research. And Kenric and I met with him once. I met with him again last week after he produced essentially what is a function, and you would just input the different parameters and it would spit out what the power index is of any particular coalition or any particular entity inside of Catalyst.
Mhm.
What I don't have is the breakdown of how to fit Catalyst into that formula. But what we could do is take some simple examples. I think Kenric brought up the key ownership between IOG, Emergo, and Cardano Foundation, and say that this is a first, at least simple example, because there's 3 entities and there's 7 total votes. How do we define what the power index is within that group? And then we could get an answer. I mean, you have an answer, right? It's
in fact, I'm going to show that next.
okay.
And the other thing I would say is maybe next week we could get together again. And I know I've given you access to the data we had from rounds 3 through 6, or 3 through 5, I guess is what we had. But it's probably good to just talk through it and actually try to, if you have the tool now, you can take a stab at it yourself since you have access to that data. And then next week we could go through it some more. And as I described in our first meeting, I think the first step is some simplifications where, and maybe I'll even just take a moment to describe, I don't think I meant to write you an email, but I don't think I got it out. So in our previous meeting, we talked about a simplification where you treat each wealth cohort, say, the wallets with between 500 and 5,000, and then between 5,000 and 50,000, et cetera, going out as a single voting block. That way there's not as many players and the computational calculations are dramatically reduced. Now, on one hand, that's not how the community votes, and it's not really a great assumption to say that everyone in a cohort is voting exactly the same, but it's a simplification that gives you a start to this kind of analysis. And what it would do is give you a measure of the potential power of each cohort.
Yep.
And then I had in mind another step in that may not be too difficult. But what if you took each cohort and divided it into two and assumed that they were voting differently? Or they were independent. They were two groups of independent votes. And then you just had the ability to change the percentage between those two, you know. So again, that way you wouldn't have to do the combinatorial work of every single wallet being independent. But if you just had two effective wallets in each cohort, and the ability to change the percentage of how much agreement there was within a cohort, that would also give you some interesting insights.
So let me say one thing and then react to that. Or let me react to that. By breaking a coalition into two and saying we can play with the percentages, it's just to give us different outcomes of knowing. It's kind of it's like synthetic data of this is how, if part of the cohort was voted this way or this way, we could just change those and see if we have any dramatic swings in power.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. What I have is very close to being the function that we can just plug in and spit out things, but
Okay.
it's not all the way there. And there's a process for what we do at Wolfram, which I'm just learning about. Is we have a resource function where somebody writes their own function, submits it, goes through a review process, and then it becomes available to basically implement within our language, our programming language. I can take it outside of that formal process and use over here on the side. And that's what I will do. It's just, maybe it's not built to tackle some of these problems, or maybe like there's going to be some extra things to define that I need some extra help with. So it's just, I'm sending it for review, then I'll go back to Seth Chandler, who created this, who doesn't work for Wolfram. And then, but yeah, I just wanted to mention that like, it's in an intermediate area. It's not quite finished.
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, being able to get that kind of review and critique is terrific.
I have a question on that one, Kenric. Actually, a thought and a question. The data which we are having effectively, does it tell us which wallet voted for which proposal? Do we have it to that granularity?
We don't have that breakdown. On fund 3 to 6, the data actually is available if you mine the Jordanga, I've said it wrong, but the sub network that does the voting. So you could potentially get that, but that's quite a lot of data. You know, the combinatorics of that are pretty immense.
Because what I'm thinking is the principle of Banzaf is actually kind of to express, did my vote have an impact? And you could approach it now from two different directions, whereby one is probably favorable, which is if you take the biggest wallets, as you know what the outcome of the vote is, and look at the voting of this wallet, in how and to which level did that effectively kind of mirror the outcome already? Yeah. So that would be an indirect measurement already, kind of in how far a specific wallet in itself is determining the outcome. Because if it would be 1-to-1, then you could say that it's kind of a dictator situation, because actually the voting power of that wallet in itself made the flip every single time.
Right. And yeah,
so if you're taking effectively kind of like the the top 10 or top 20 and more or less kind of do an analysis on that side to see in how far did the voting of these wallets mirror the actual outcome that might be an indirect indication of the power this vote in itself had.
Yeah, what I had in mind, and my colleague and I did some initial work, but we weren't able to complete it, is the following that's similar to what you're describing, is even if you don't have the mapping, in addition to doing the actual combinatorial theoretical calculation that Steph is describing,
Yeah.
you can also do a kind of empirical analysis of an actual vote, right? So you can look at the results and then you can say, well, how many times, you could look at the whole outcome of all the votes, and then you could examine each wallet if you considered each wallet like one additional vote, and would that have been enough to win, or the other way around, if you took the winning projects, right, and you assumed that it subtracted one wallet, you could look at the percentage of times that a particular wallet had the ability to change it from going from a winning proposal to a losing proposal, and get a kind of empirical bonds-off index for that particular voting round.
And there is probably a second element to that one, which is where the vote in itself is pretty balanced, and small wallets by a sudden create a tipping point.
That's right, exactly. So sometimes, exactly right. So sometimes if the vote was very close, then even small wallets would influence it. But what you'll see is a kind of cumulative distribution function where the large wallet can always, can influence a lot larger percentage of outcomes.
Yeah, and it would be quite interesting because actuating dReps would represent a certain percentage of vote in itself, and in an ideal world, and retrospectively after once we implemented that, we will probably see in how far effectively dRep wallets could be in the one or the other section in itself. So for example, determine the vote in sense of dictatorship, or being the decisive vote to effectively push a certain proposal through it. So effectively just looking at the ones which are just came in, like the last 2 or 3 which just got funded. Who voted for those? Because at the end of the day, everything else might be in the middle somewhere, but the point in itself is it would be quite interesting to understand in which areas either a concentration of voting power or the knowledge about where things are on the border and which vote might have a difference. That is kind of where this dynamics of the voting system in itself start to play, right?
Yeah. I think this is a good moment for me to show you this example. And it turns out that there's a tool on the web that's a little bit like what Steph is suggesting they're going to be able to develop. I think his tool will be a little bit more encompassing than this, but nevertheless, it's an interesting tool, and I'll show it to you now. Let me.
So I stop share here.
Yeah, let me share my own screen because I'll
Yeah.
show the actual. That was an image of it, but I'll show the actual
This one.
screen. It might be a little clear. It's not easy to see. Let me see if I can even make this larger, actually. Let's see. So if okay. Hopefully that's somewhat visible. Are you able to see what I'm sharing?
Yeah, it's quite zoomed in.
Okay, fine. So what I did here is I inputted 3 players to represent IOHK, the Cardano Foundation, and Emergo. And then I inputted their initial weights on these 7 keys. So IOHK had 3, and then CF and Emergo each had 2. And then a vote of 5 total was required to make a decision, to approve a decision. And one of the things you see right away is that in order to reach 5, you have to have approval from IOHK. CF and Emergo were not able to make decisions as a pair. And that has a significant influence on the power that these players have. So if the way you look at all the potential coalitions, if someone wanted to try to act on their own, for instance, but in this case, those would all lose. Or if you have pairs. But while the 2 pairs that include IOHK are winners, the pair that excludes IOHK is a loser. And then there's the coalition with all 3 approving that's also a winner. So now in bold is shown the 5 cases where you have a critical vote. That critical vote means that if you took that vote out, the win would turn to a loss. And then as you look at the ratio at the bottom here, you see that IOHK ends up with a power index of 60, even though, 3/7 is more like 43%, but their actual power is 60%. And then for CF and Emergo, they start with 1/7, 2/7, which is about, if I remember right, about 28%. But that gets reduced down to 20% in terms of their actual influence on outcomes. And what strikes me in this is, so most people would not be able to see that subtle increase in power that the person with 3 keys gets. And so there's this kind of subtlety in the power distribution that's not very visible to most people. But furthermore, I think this partly plays out in the dynamics between the 3 players too over time. Because for instance, and I'm not saying this happened, and maybe I won't even refer to the names anymore as I go forward, but just keeping it in the abstract. If the 2 weaker parties feel strongly about a particular issue, but they can't get agreement from the stronger party, right? Then they may, in that instance, feel disenfranchised from something that they together feel is important. And over time, if they can't influence things that they have a disagreement on with the more powerful player, they may feel that continuing to be involved in this game isn't to their benefit. Now, okay, so that's all in the abstract, but then just to conclude this, part of what the chatter within the community has been recently, that in fact, at some point, either CF or Emergo delegated their keys to IOHK. And at that point, why don't I go ahead and just show what happens here? It's a very easy game to understand now, but if I change this to 5 and 0, and then measure the power index again, what you see now is that there's only 3. The second player, who still owes 2 keys, has no power left. So their power goes to for one party delegating to the powerful one, the second party also loses all of its power. And now, even just one person delegating gives IOHK a dictator control over the decisions, and the other player becomes a dummy vote. Even if they choose to vote, it's never going to influence anything. So this is a nice, very simple example but I think it illustrates why this work is so important, because even in a more complicated game with many more players, these kinds of power issues are going to play out. And you're going to have to set up the system, if decentralization is an important value to try to maintain over a long period of time. You have two very difficult things to accomplish. Number one, you have to set up initial conditions that favor decentralized decision-making. But then you have an even more difficult thing where if the initial conditions favor a few people, those players will tend to have the ability to further increase their power in the system. And as they do so, you kind of naturally converge to more centralized decision making. And I think I don't feel that this is well understood in this community, that the process towards centralization is very natural. It is the default. And so you have to have controlling elements to guard against that, not just in the initial conditions, but in the way you monitor and take corrective action when you see it, when you see the decentralization process degrading.
Kenric,
Let me stop sharing. Well, should I stop sharing, or did
I'll keep it for a moment though, because
yeah, okay, fine.
I think it's very compelling. If we did a presentation of it, we'd have to be careful of the language we use, because, for example, Kevin Hammond would say that the other entities lend their vote in terms of like where they're giving IOG the access to the other keys. If we're using that as an example, so we just need to be careful. But I think that point about centralization spreading, being the default position, the need to kind of push back against that, and how difficult that is a really critical point. It's a really critical point, and it's something that really should be known more widely. And so if we can,
there's quite a lot of literature on that in the complex systems literature. And let me stop sharing for a second, and I can just talk about this. And I can provide references to the group if you're interested in looking at this yourself. There was a famous result going back, I think, to the 80s or maybe even earlier, called preferential growth. And what they showed is that part of why networks tend towards a power law distribution in how many connections a particular node has is that larger nodes tend to grow preferentially because new members to the community have a preference to link up to popular nodes. So for instance, now, and even this goes back 20 years ago, if you were brand new to learning about the internet and wanting to use it, one of the very first things you'll do now is a Google search, right? And so you become a new node to that Google search. And over time, if you go back to the early days of the internet, right, there were 10 different, very competitive search engines, right? But as Google kind of became the best one that people got the most use out of, its position became extremely dominant to the point that it's now centralized a lot of the functionality of the internet. And those same kind of things you can see playing out already in the cryptocurrency space. And it's because it's a very there's a kind of foundational physical you can show physical processes that force this to happen.
There's a kind of folk philosophy going around Catalyst with the term where you can have decentralization by centralizing first. I've heard, I'm not sure if anyone has heard this, but I've heard this around some parts of the community, and it's a perception that's just wrong, essentially.
Yeah, no, that won't work.
And so this is quite a nice pill for that, to a reality check on that a little bit, perhaps.
Yeah, and another interesting case, again, I don't know if it's relevant to our immediate study, but it's not to say that decentralization doesn't have strength and can't work, you know, and the whole history of Linux is a very powerful case study where a lot of people were dismissive of the Linux community in comparison to IBM, Microsoft, and Apple, who were quite dominant in computer architectures and software. And yet, even within Linux, you know, years later, for instance, a very central player, IBM, kind of accepted that Linux had become dominant, and they built Linux into their own architectures, and then eventually bought Red Hat, you know, the most dominant commercial distributor of the Linux operating system. So there's a kind of, I'm not intimately familiar with this history, but I think, you know, there's a kind of, the decentralization did win, right, in this instance, but in a sense, it still gets captured by the central powers within the computing industry. And you know, again, playing it out. Well, as you said, maybe before I make more comments on that, we could think through a presentation on this particular issue around decision making with the keys. Our focus, of course, is on the dReps process, which is much more complex. But the point is, even though it's going to be more complex, even though it's going to have some decentralized properties to it, if you're not measuring the actual bands-off power index, you don't know where the real power is in that system.
Are you thinking that we could have like a kind of intermediate release? You could, because you could very quickly do a presentation on this example of the bands-off index, and we could release it in the next couple of weeks or something at a town hall or something like that, can we?
Yeah, that's definitely a possibility. Maybe another thing to think about with this as a team is, this example could be written up as part of Steph's work, and I'd be happy to do that with him if he finds it to be a useful example for his section. That's one possibility of how it can fit into our white paper.
I find it useful just in general. Yeah.
Yeah. So it also could fit as like a longer introduction that maybe, in other words, right now in the outline, I haven't really defined a section for Steve, myself, and Thorsten as the editors, but oftentimes that would be the case, that we would have like a longer introduction, and this could be part of that. I mean, it depends, I think, and that might be part, maybe the thing to do is, the three of us, I'll set up another meeting for the three of us as editors. And we can talk a kind of about what our scope is for editing this, and if that includes writing our own section or not.
Yeah, I would support, if you want to do that as a kind of interim. It might raise interest in what we're doing. I mean, there's obviously the risk that you have to be very careful, because it can be quite a controversial subject, that subject. So we'd have to be very clear about what we're trying to communicate, you know. Yeah. So yeah, should we go back to the agenda now? Because we're coming to the
yeah, in fact, we should wrap up.
Yeah. So I'm just skipping over Frank's section and onto any other business. I'll include what you wrote, Kenric, in the documentation. Okay. On Zotero, there was an action to create a different section. Zotero, Justin? I'm not sure if that's just
I didn't action on that one. I will do that this week.
okay. Thank you for that. And I just added a brief update. Over Charles's talk there was a mention of something called an Edinburgh Decentralization Index. I just want to mention that in any other business. There's documentation of that I can provide links to. And it's obviously something we need to be aware of going forward in terms of how this work will relate to the Decentralization Index. I'm not sure if anyone wants to comment on that, but then we just talked about an after town hall but this possibly could be for a simple presentation of the bands off index or the bands off index example. And then that's it. If anyone's got any other items they want to raise or any other comments or notices. And if not, I can stop the share and stop recording.